The third observation I would make on that is that it's simply harder to find parcels with sufficient timber stocking to meet their investment profile. Put another way, the quick, easy money has already been made.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Maine is the most forested state in the nation, and we've got more contiguous forest than any state east of the Mississippi. Everything we do, and much of who we are, is all about that forest. It's where we hunt and fish, it's where we ride and paddle, it's where most of Maine's abundant wildlife is, and most of that forest is owned by somebody else. Every decision made about how forests are managed has an impact on how we can use them and what there is to enjoy in them. For 150 years, not much changed. And then, everything did. And then changed again, and might be changing a third time right now. We're going to join the discussion this morning, but that will happen right after we pay a visit with a Maine Woods Gourmet Girl. Stand by. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by a.m.and Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and Supercuts in Bangor, Brewer, and Old Town. The Maine Harvest Festival is in Bangor at the Cross Insurance Center today, going on until 5 p.m. I never miss it. And typically I carry home lots of Maine-made produce, some specialized food items, and usually a leg of lamb and some local sausage. And every year I wonder who some of these exhibitors are. Many are household businesses in the rural parts of the state, and many of the products are based on Maine's outdoor heritage or are created using the state's own natural resources. Take, for example, Maine Woods Gourmet Girl. Who runs a specialty food company out of Greenville? Well, I just had to know. So I stopped in on Abby Freethy, a professional chef who has been creating yummy stuff and other nature-based products in Greenville for the last decade. You'll find her goods in 160 different Maine shops and stores and at the Harvest Festival today. And you'll find me right now in her production kitchen in Greenville, surrounded by lots of ovens and stainless steel. So, Abby, what is it you do?
Well, we manufacture value-added products with a lot of heart and soul in them. We initially began with ketchup, and now we have 3 kinds: charred onion, jalapeno, and our country ketchup, which is the catalyst for the entire company. And we produce probably 25 products. It varies from season to season. Some are seasonal, like fiddleheads, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We do that in a short run, and whoever gets them, gets them.
Mm-hmm.
And we may try some one-offs like cornichons or, other things. But we have our staple core products, and they would include Wild Woman Jam, which I'm sure you would really like.
It's that obvious, huh?
It's true. Under that calm demeanor, I can tell. But it is one of the most popular sellers, and it's because of the name. But then when people eat the product, they realize there's no junk in the jar. And so we are now distributing our product widely throughout Maine. We probably have 160 stores that we sell to. They don't take our whole line, some of them. But some places like the Bangor Airport, which is a great outlet for us, you'll find giant kiosk before security and one after security. And then I find that I'm getting orders from these crazy places that I never would have thought we would have saturated. So it's kind of neat.
When you look around the state, you see operations like a Ray's Mustard in Eastport, for instance, which makes really high-quality food in unusual places. And so Maine Woods Gourmet Girl sort of fits that niche.
Yeah, and we're friendly with Ray's.
Are you?
Yeah, they sell our product there, and in turn, they do some things for us, and it's good. There's a whole food movement in Maine, and I'm so proud to be a part of that. And and being in one of the most rural spots that we could possibly be, and the most beautiful, certainly has its appeal. And we try to sell that sizzle, the purity of Maine. And it's true and it's honest. We do not adulterate our products, and they're from the heart for sure.
There's a little bit of Greenville in every jar, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, and I try to talk about Greenville in the best light possible, even though sometimes it's difficult to run a business here. but I feel like we've been pretty successful. And they say if you're still in business, you're still in business.
There is something to really celebrate, I think, in Maine going on right now, because you put your finger right on it. We do have a lot of homegrown food products these days, where we have more organic farming these days. We have products like the ones you're making. We have craft beer, which is now some of the best in the world happening around the state. All of a sudden, we're making some really good local stuff.
Well, yeah, I think it's been just brewing for such a long time to capitalize on your beer comment, which I'm all for. Absolutely. And we have actually brewed a beer with Penobscot Bay Brewery called Greenville Grit IPA.
Is that right?
Yep. And Mike Anderson and Joan Anderson will be at the Harvest Festival as well, showing their wares. And that was so fun. So the local bars had our beer here in Greenville for a short run. And when we get the gumption again, we'll brew another one. But I think Greenville should have a brewery. I think it'd be superb.
So where do your ingredients come from? Are they local? You import them from elsewhere?
We do as much local as possible, but of course...
Because we don't grow a lot of tomatoes.
No. And the product that we need for our tomatoes is not... We don't start with like a fresh tomato. That would be incredibly arduous, and our product would be extremely expensive. So we start with a paste and then a crushed tomato. And we have broached the subject with the local growers here, and we'll work towards the tomato product. And we continually do that. We continually revamp and look at where our product is coming from. Cherries don't come from Maine. We have a cherry tartlet preserve. They come from Pennsylvania, where I'm originally from, and that's okay with me. The onions that go in the balsamic onion, the caramelized balsamic onions, come from a organic farmer in Parkman. Most of the time we buy those in bulk, and we make giant batches of them, and we hopefully can carry through the year with those products. But anything we can get from Maine, we certainly try to do that. Walnuts, we don't grow them. They come from California.
Right,
yeah. But I'll assure you that Wild Maine blueberry jam we get those, right from Hancock County.
Well, I would certainly hope so.
Yes, without a doubt.
Now, your website is northwoodsgourmetgirl.com, or?
Yeah.
Good, because I was guessing.
You
I looked it up, and then I forgot what the address was.
It's long, but yeah, you can order anything we have online. Some of the textiles are not available, but online you have to come to the store in Greenville.
You have been, and you are a chef.
Yes, I am, yeah.
So are you constantly inventing new stuff, perfecting what you've done, or are you happy with the product line now and it keeps you too busy?
What we're really doing here at Northwoods Gourmet Girl is creating a brand where the food is the cornerstone. So we have some clothing pieces that are designed, and the prints are painted by me. And then we have pieces of furniture. And so what we're really trying to do is expound on that idea, is it not just be a food company, but it be a well-rounded company that reflects what we have in the Northwoods of Maine. One
of the things about eating locally produced food is knowing where your food came from, because so much of what's out there in the grocery shelves, who knows where it came from? At least, you know where this came from. You made it.
That's right.
What else are you making?
Well, we have on the chopping block a line of frozen foods that are packaged with a health-conscious person in mind. I've been studying a great deal about nutrition and the pieces of the puzzle that would be prophylactic in helping you in your health. And so we have a line of frozen foods coming out that you'll see in the local area in November, and it's very exciting for us. It's been a lot of work, and we're working with a local company in Bangor to produce this new product.
I'm glad I dropped in, because I'm very excited to see good food produced locally from an area that's not known for that. For the North Woods, for Greenville, to be able to produce food products this good is pretty exciting, in my opinion.
And what's your favorite product?
Oh, the ketchup. Abby Freethy. She's the North Woods Gourmet Girl. If you go to the Harvest Festival in Bangor today, you will see her. Up next, who owns the woods? It matters. You've probably seen it yourself. Some parts of Maine's forest are managed differently than others. Some have more access. Some have more wildlife. Some aren't what they used to be, and some are better. And all of that is changing right beneath our feet. A group called Maine Woods Forever brought that to a roundtable discussion, and I was there, and you're about to share it. So stand by. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. There are 4 iconic landmarks that define Maine, or at least this end of Maine. The rock-bound coast, Moosehead Lake, Baxter State Park, and the North Maine Woods. Whatever happens to any one of them affects everyone. You can almost feel it. It's where we recreate, hunt, and fish, and just watch all that wildlife that is home to Maine like nowhere else on this side of the continent. Baxter State Park may be forever wild. The rocky coast is going to stay rocky, and Moosehead Lake is going to stay a lake, but the forest is forever changing, and it has been for as long as humans have been burning it or logging it. Over the last 30 years, those changes have become profound. Several groups have formed to deal with those changes as best we can. Maine Woods Forever is one of those. Maine Woods Forever is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the legacy of Maine's forests and woodlands by promoting stewardship of the natural resources, finding common ground with a whole bunch of diverse people and groups to foster responsible use and shared stewardship, and working with others to designate exceptional natural, cultural, and historic sites for the generations of today and tomorrow. One of the things this group is good at is bringing the right people into the room to talk about it. In the last decade, they pulled together 32 roundtables to address the issues and opportunities up in the Maine forest. Today's show is that 32nd one.
And when I refer to the Maine Woods, and as I referred to it this morning, I'm talking about the 10 to 12 million acres, depending on where you draw that southern boundary of it, of large forest ownerships, undeveloped forest ownerships that together comprise the largest undeveloped contiguous tract of forest land east of the Mississippi, and from an ecological point of view, one of the largest contiguous broadleaf and mixed wood forests in temperate zone.
Jerry Bly is today's presenter at the roundtable. He currently runs an outfit called Creative Conservation. He's been rattling around conservation projects in the North Woods for at least 3 decades, including a stint in the State House under Governor Angus King.
I actually cut my teeth in my environmental career working on the last spruce budworm outbreak back in the early 1980s, and it's a bit humbling to have your professional career defined by insect cycles, but here we are again with the budworm on our doorstep. Since I first became involved in working in the Maine Woods, that would have been in the 1980s, over 80% of the land, over 80% of that 10 to 12 million acres, has switched hands at least once. And some of those parcels multiple times. Someone asked me before how I keep track of it all, and the answer is I don't.
And that's the key takeaway for everything else that is to come in this roundtable. The talk is entitled, Whose Woods These Are? Maybe most Mainers know how much, but it bears repeating. All of a sudden, 80% of Maine's northern forest changed ownership, and all the assumptions about what would happen with Maine's forest suddenly changed with it, from how the forest is managed to conservation, and even what species of wildlife do better and which do worse.
But that's a remarkable number. And then when I looked a step further and said, okay, who of the large land ownerships is around today that was around back in the 1980s, and you can count them on one hand. You have the Pingree heirs, 7 islands. You have the Bascahegan lands, the Milliken lands, and you have Prentice and Carlisle, both their own lands and the family lands that they represent. 3 landowners, I sort of cut off at 100,000 acres or more, that are still around today that were around 30 years ago. And I recall back in, the most intense turnover of lands was probably in the 1990s, and I remember as I was apt to do, to making hyperbolic remarks about what the future might hold, and being told at times by certain folks that, well, nothing's really changing, other than the signs on the mills or the offices of those landowners. But in fact, that's not the case. Ownership matters. You ask any good forester what is the first thing that he or she does when they're hired to manage property, and they will tell you that they ask the landowner what their objectives are. That is what sets the tone for forest management. Ownership matters, particularly in forestry, where the decisions made today have implications for decades, in some cases generations, to come. So what I would like to do today is really four things. First is to take a historic look at changing forest land ownership patterns over the past 30 years and the lessons and the insights to be had from that. Second, as part of that, understand the implications of different types of forest land ownership and the forest management, the implications both for forest management as well as for conservation. Then I will offer my observation as to what's going on in the woods today. And lastly, I'm going to close by discussing an interesting endeavor that I'm currently involved with that may shed some light on a new path to stability and sustainability in the Maine woods. Looking at the forest over the past 30 years, prior to the late 1980s, the bulk of the ownership, the great majority of the ownership in the Maine woods was industrial forest lands. And I know that term gets used a lot in different circumstances today, but really the true definition of industrial land ownership are lands that are owned by a landowner that also owns a processing facility, typically a mill, and that those lands served as a primary resource to provide raw materials for that wood. So why was that important? What difference did it make? I would offer the following 3 points. The mills were the profit centers. That's where the money was made, not the land. And the companies were not really interested in maximizing profit from the land. It was there primarily, first and foremost, as providing raw material for the mills. That made it such that they were not terribly interested in developing the land, selling the land, conserving the land, quite honestly, and were primarily interested in managing that land for species that their mills required. And in the spruce fir country of Maine, where there's a substantial hardwood component, that hardwood component of the forest was literally ignored by a number of the large landowners back then because that's not what they were using in their mills. And so you have instances of herbiciding mature hardwood stands to try to release softwood from beneath. But it was an ignored resource and continues to be fairly substantial in certain areas of the North Woods.
The voice you hear is Jerry Bly. He's a longtime conservation expert in the state, and he's sharing his thoughts at a roundtable sponsored by a group called Maine Woods Forever. As we go to break, ponder this. What difference does it make if the landowner is local or from away? And what difference does it make if the landowner owns the mill that's using the wood or doesn't? This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm at a roundtable presentation hosted by Maine Woods Forever. Jerry Bly is a conservation expert who is offering his thoughts on the dramatic changes that have taken place to ownership in the northern Maine forest. As we went into the break, Jerry had made the point about how the land is treated when owned and managed by the same company that owns the mill using the wood. Now, some of these companies, in fact, most of them, were from away. But
they had a presence in Maine in their mills, and that made a difference as well. They were inclined to have their lands be utilized in a way that the public wanted. So that first and foremost was open access, but it went beyond that as well. And they really truly did try to accommodate the public on their lands. And then the last point that I would make regarding the old industrial ownerships is that there was this bond between the mill and the land that was both strong and long-term in nature. And as a result of that, some of those companies invested very heavily in intensive forest management practices. Some you may like, some you may not, but everything from herbiciding to planting to pre-commercial thinning, because that was the resource they were looking for to feed their mills.
But this is America, with an economy that is run by corporations and tax accountants. Sooner or later, somebody was going to ask, why do we have to own all this land if all we want is the wood on it? That ties up all kinds of capital that could be invested elsewhere, like maybe in some other country. Furthermore, all of the mill owners were C corporations, meaning that they paid corporate income tax, and then any shareholder who profited would pay personal taxes. Double taxation. Sooner or later, some accountant would think, there are other tax break entities out there that could own these lands, make more money off the land itself, and pay less in taxes.
So, as most of you know, that whole model was shattered in the late 1980s when a British financier took over Diamond Occidental, which was a major landowner in northern New England, about 1 million acres across 3 states, and decided to break apart that company into pieces, the lands, the mills, the facilities, and sell them to the highest bidder. They auctioned off over 1 million acres of land in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And that was just about the same time as there was a very substantial development boom, particularly in terms of second homes, where everybody was buying 40-acre lots in the wilderness and all that sort of thing. So the combination of two was very volatile and raised the fear that the Maine woods were going to end up as a lot of subdivisions. The diamond sale gave rise to congressional action. That's where the Forest Legacy Program had its roots. That's where the Northern Forest Lands Council that I served on was originated. That was a congressional effort, 5-year effort, really very, very substantial process and a fairly formidable product as well. And that was all based upon a concern, a fear that the diamond sale portended some sort of wholesale shift in forest land ownership. And in fact it did. For once, the alarmists were correct. And what happened in the years that followed is that Wall Street took notice, the bean counters and whatnot, and in essence demanded that all of the industrial owners follow in various ways the diamond's lead and unload their non-productive assets, the forest land that wasn't producing the dollars that the shareholders and others demanded. And so what occurred over the next 20 years was that the acreage of industrial timberlands in Maine plummeted, and you can see what became of industrial land ownership in Maine, from about 8 million acres to about 2 million acres or so, much of which is actually owned by non-U.S. companies, and most notably Irving. So, where did all this land go? Again, I know many of you are aware of this, but by and large, the great majority of that land, those loss of 6 million acres there, ended up in a variety of types of timberland investors, fondly referred to as TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations, that included a variety of entities, from insurance companies to pension companies that were investing their assets, to a variety of timber investment firms that pooled together asset pools from wealthy individuals, from university endowments, from variety of investment sources. And in essence, in 2012, that number is just about 8 million acres. So basically, flip-flop with the industrial ownership. So what are the implications of that shift? Again, a couple key points. Unlike the industrial ownership, there were no mills to make profits. The profits came from the land, from selling off kingdom lots, selling off tracts to timber liquidators, charging timber tolls, selling off lease lots, raising lease fees, discontinuing friendly long-term leases with sporting camps and other operations, commercial operations in the woods. The new generation of landowners was looking to make money from those lands. And a part of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, was a willingness to cash in on the conservation values of those properties. Quote from Plum Creek's annual reports, and when I gave you the list of TIMOs, I forgot to mention a different form, which is represented by Plum Creek, which is a publicly traded real estate investment trust, a different model than some of the other TIMOs out there. And in their annual report, they state that creating the most value from each acre is part of Plum Creek's DNA. And that just, I think, exemplifies the whole mindset of a TIMO, that's where their profit lies, in figuring out how to extract value from each acre of land. Another point to be made regarding the majority, not the entirety, of timber investment TIMOs is a short-term investment horizon. Most of them are set up with 10 to 15-year investment horizons. Investors invest money with the expectation that they will get their money back out and whatever profits within that sort of time period. I mentioned Plum Creek as a real estate investment trust. That's a little bit different. They don't have those specific time horizons associated with their investments. Investments come, investments go for them.
And there it is, the tax advantages that changed how the Northwoods are owned. Investors in a timber investment management organization, a TIMO, make a long-term investment, and when it gets cashed out 10 or 15 years down the road, the profits are taxed at the lower capital gains rate. Our real estate investment trust, or REIT, such as Plum Creek, is a tax-advantaged investment structure that treats real estate as if it were a stock, and then there's no corporate income tax paid, either federal or state, and any income is only taxed as capital gains.
Well, what does that mean? Well, if you're in the forest management business, it generally means no interest in investing in long-term management because you're not going to see the results of that investment. So things such as planting trees, thinning trees, other types of pre-commercial activities, it's just not going to be part of that, because in the forest real estate world, you never get back those investments when selling a property. You may get them back if you're around long enough to harvest the trees, but you won't see the benefits of that. A buyer of your property is not going to be paying you for the intensive forest management practices that you invested in on that property. It just the market has not, to date, worked that way. And then the last point I would make regarding the TIMOs is that by and large, they're non-resident owners that have little stake in the communities. I mean, in many cases, they barely have time to get to know folks before it's time to, cash out of that investment cycle. So they don't have long enough time to put in roots. And so there's not that sort of ongoing relationship that traditionally there had been with either the industrial owners or, in other cases, with the family owners, such as the Pingrees, those sort of relationships as well.
But there's more to the story. What if you could sell the land but keep it at the same time? Sell off the development rights, sell off conservation parcels. What happened next took a lot of people by surprise. Jerry Bly is a conservation expert who's presenting his bird's eye view of this whole thing to a roundtable of Maine Woods Forever. We'll get back to it in a minute. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket with Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. On today's show, we are at a roundtable put on by a group called Maine Woods Forever. For more than 3 decades, Jerry Bly has been involved with many conservation projects within the state, So he's had a lot of time to take a close look at ownership of the northern Maine forest and how it has changed and continues to change even now. One thing that came along with the mill selling off their lands was a sudden rise in conservation. The new landowners could make money selling off easements and even specific parcels that were more valuable as conserved natural features than as timberland.
So as I mentioned earlier, the other major outcome of that post-industrial ownership era was an incredible expansion of conservation ownership in the North Woods, both in terms of fee ownership as well as advent of landscape-level working forest easements. Basically, we went from about 4% of conserved lands in the state of Maine to where we're at about 20% now. So turning to the present, in my view, from where I sit, there appears to be the makings of another transformation of ownership in the Maine woods, more subtle than the last, and certainly a work in progress, but potentially no less significant. So I'm going to give you 10 observations. Here's my top 10 list. So observation number 1, TIMOs have been selling their holdings as their 10 to 15-year investment cycles come to a close, and they're not appearing to be replaced with new TIMO investments. Why is that? Well, here's some possible explanations. Those forest land investments are going elsewhere where there appear to be more attractive opportunities, to the southeast, to the northwest, upper Midwest, and internationally. Worries about the future of Maine markets. They see the headlines of mill closings, and that potentially scares people off, whether they should or not. That's how the investment community works. They don't like risk. And then the third observation I would make on that is that it's simply harder to find parcels with sufficient timber stocking to meet their investment profile. Put another way, the quick, easy money has already been made. So that's observation number 1. Observation number 2 is that the sale of the TIMO acreage has largely gone to new high net worth individuals. John Malone now owns over 1 million acres of land in Maine. Tall Timbers, which is the Buck family, owns about half that much, as well as some quite a few smaller players that own tens of thousands, but not the hundreds of thousands. Are these the beginning of new long-term timberland owners like the Pingrees and the Bascahegan lands, or just a passing fad? It's hard to know at this point. After several decades of fragmentation in the North Woods, some of these new buyers are actually reconsolidating land holdings, something we really haven't seen at all. So while there are signs that this new breed of forest owners has a stewardship ethic and a patient approach to forest management, time will tell. But there's certainly that potential. And Maine, we have this historic legacy of large family ownerships. I believe the Pingrees acquired their first lands in 1820 or something like that. So just a remarkable legacy there. And if we are potentially starting a new legacy of similar sorts, that would be an interesting thing indeed. Observation number 3 is that we've seen less churning of lands by timber contractors who historically have bought, harvested, and resold lands within the space of a couple of years. And in fact, and this I definitely see, a number of those players have begun to accumulate legacy lands that they're passing on to the next generation of those owners. Can't project where that will go, but this has often been a group that has always had a very short-term, shortest possible term land ownership timeline in the space of literally a couple of years, and that seems to be less so. Again, there may be underlying reasons for that, those sorts of potential liquidation parcels are not as readily available. And also in terms on the selling end of things, there's not the development market, as many people looking at cutover land for potential development opportunities as there used to be. Observation number 4, the amount of fee land, so lands owned in fee by conservation organizations, has now risen to well over 500,000 acres. That's not an insignificant chunk of land, and that includes nature conservancies, fee holdings in the St. John, Duchesne, and over Moose River country. It includes the Appalachian Mountain Clubs. They're all represented, I think, around the table one way or the other. 70,000 acres of ownership east of Moosehead Lake. TNC's acquisitions have an ecological focus to them. AMC's acquisitions have a recreational focus to them. And then Down East Lakes Land Trust has their community forests, where they're managing them for sort of a range of community-related purposes, including recreation and the West Grand area, as well as supporting the local wood products industry, as well as they've proceeded with carbon sales on their lands. And then can't forget Roxanne Quimby, Elliotsville Plantation, and her acquisitions of land east of the park, and desire to create a new national park.
The voice you hear belongs to Jerry Bly, an expert in land conservation in Maine for more than 30 years. He's presenting to a roundtable of Maine Woods Forever. About 30 of us gather to think about the past, present, and future of the northern Maine forest. 6 observations to go, so stand by. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Today's show is coming to you from a roundtable discussion presented by Maine Woods Forever. The speaker is Jerry Bly, who has been steadily involved with Maine forest conservation projects for 3 decades. So far, we've covered the history of land ownership of the Maine forest, how it changed suddenly, and how it looks like it's changing again. We'll peek at the future in a moment, but right now, we're getting his top 10 observations about what's going on. And we just finished number 4 heading into the break.
Observation number 5. In addition to the transition of land ownership, we're seeing a transition in markets, which translates into how the forests are managed. We've all seen the headlines of the past number of weeks, and quite honestly the past number of years, of mill closings. They're grabbing the headlines as they should. But in addition to the lost jobs and the impact to the communities and where those mills are located, it has implications in terms of markets for timberland owners, and that in turn has implications for forest management. The most recent closings raised the prospect that in certain parts of the state that forest landowners will not have a market for softwood pulp. And that is in those stands where that is an important component that can significantly impact viability and the type of cutting operations that might occur in those stands. But getting lost in the bad news, there's been some major expansions over the past 5 years in certain mills and pulpwood mills, primarily on the hardwood side of things, but the Sappy Mill in Somerset, more recently the Woodland Mill. And despite what many, including myself, might expect, Maine still is a net importer of pulp for the mills.
Jerry says that saw logs are doing well too, including Irving's new mill in Ashland that's laser controlled and produces lumber faster than you can blink. Observation number 6 is maybe no surprise. There's not nearly the pressure of second home development up in the Northwoods right now. The real estate bubble bust took all the wind out of financing vacation homes using equity on your first home, and mortgage practices have tightened up, so subdivision development has gone almost to a halt.
And you look at Plum Creek, their Moosehead project, which was approved 5 years ago for many hundreds of lots, and they've shown, to my knowledge, absolutely no interest in moving forward with any of those development plans at this point. Observation number 7, landowner investments in improving forest productivity, such as pre-commercial thinning, planting, herbicide spraying, are few and far between. There clearly is efficiencies there and long-term economic return there, but when you have a situation where somebody's investment horizon is 10 or 15 years, you're not going to see that. I mean, it doesn't pay back. There's no way to get it to pay back in that sort of period of time. And so where is that intensive management occurring? It's occurring on Seven Islands land, long-term owner. It's occurring on Irving lands, a relatively new but known to be a long-term owner of lands. And I believe some on Plum Creek lands. I don't have first-hand experience there. But everywhere else, you don't see. And years ago, we saw many thousands of acres being planted and herbicided and whatnot. Observation number 8. Sort of in the background on a lot of the Northwoods lands are timber supply agreements that occurred when the mills sold the lands. They sold their non-productive assets. Many of those lands were sold with timber supply agreements that guaranteed a future supply of wood for those mills coming from those lands in some manner. And those many were long-term agreements, some as long as 45 years. So many of them are still very much in place, and they have, in a number of respects, sort of muted activities on those lands because they come with this encumbrance, I guess is what you would call it. It's prevented the landowners from fragmenting those lands to a great degree because many of those timber supply agreements, they limit the outsales of land and certainly limit the acres of land that can be pulled out of those timber supply agreements. And more recently, we've learned that these timber supply agreements can be a substantial impediment to conservation as well. Observation number 9, the expansion of forest certification and more professional logging operations has definitely brought changes to the Maine woods, and that indeed is becoming the norm, and that is a good thing. However, some research recently released from the University of Maine found that from 1999 to 2012, and I would say up front that that's a very short period of time to be looking at balance of harvest and growth, but they looked at certified lands and found that the removals on those lands exceeded net growth across private certified lands. So by that definition of sustainability in that very short period of time, it was not meeting that. And a particular worry was the imbalance, that the greatest imbalance were the more mature stands, that were losing that component of the forest faster than other components of the forest, the mature, particularly the hardwood, as well as both hardwood and softwood stands.
That's a big one. If you're up in the woods a lot, you may see as much forest as ever. But the trees are younger and smaller. You don't see many tracts of land that look like the mature growth you'd find in, say, Baxter State Park. A thriving forest should have a mix of ages. When all the trees are saplings, your deer herd disappears, and carnivores like bears and coyotes do better. New coniferous growth is good for Canada lynx because it's good for snowshoe hare. You can see all this yourself. It has a big impact on wildlife, especially game species.
And last, but certainly not least, is the whole issue of carbon and carbon credits and how they may influence the Maine woods. And that has yet to evolve in a major way, and in terms of having a major influence. There's been a number of conservation organizations, Appalachian Mountain Club, I think the Down East Forest, Down East Lakes Community Forest have become participants in carbon credits, but that's mostly been on the nonprofit conservation side of things. But I know of late of for-profit TMOs that are pursuing carbon credits in other states, and I think a lot of this will depend, as you well know, on public policy with regards to climate change and carbon. But there's incredible potential there for that to be a major influence in the Maine woods in terms of providing landowners with another source of income for managing lands in a very long-term stewardship sort of manner. So what does it all mean? When it all comes down to it, I come back to an underlying challenge that was as true 30 years ago as it is today, and I was able to extract a little passage from the Northern Forest Lands Council's report back in the mid-1990s, and it went, In our discussions, time and time again, we face a fundamental conflict between market-driven efficiency that encourages maximum consumption of resources with the least possible effort in the shortest time, and society's responsibility to provide future generations with the same benefits that we enjoy today. We believe that until the roots of this conflict are addressed and the economic rules change so that markets reward long-term sustainability and recognize the value of well-functioning natural systems, existing market forces will continue to encourage shorter-term exploitation instead of long-term conservation of the northern forest.
In other words, we're all screwed. Short-term profits and long-term stewardship seldom go together, but they can, and we should pay attention. The speaker was Jerry Bly, conservation expert. The roundtable group was Maine Woods Forever, and the radio show is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and Supercuts in Bangor, Brewer, and Old Town. It airs every Saturday morning at 9, Sunday morning at 8, and online afterwards at 929theticket.com. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.